This is the Science Podcast for March 5th, 2026. I'm Kevin McLean. First up, a peek into the roiling seas of U.S. science policy. Sarah Crespi spoke with several news writers to discuss changing rules, regulations, and leadership in U.S. science agencies, as well as an accusation of a small nuclear arms test in China that may spur weapons testing in the U.S. and Russia. Next on the show, a clever wartime spider farmer and a look at space law are among the topics of this year's children's book roundup. Senior science editor Valerie Thompson joins host Sarah Crespi to discuss the books and reviews of them, written by science staffers and sometimes their kids.
Last month, in February, there was just a flurry of science policy stories, particularly at the end. I grabbed our ScienceInsider Editor, Jocelyn Kaiser, and our few reporters that work policy-adjacent beats to catch us up. We talked at the end of last week, and of course, things may have happened, like my voice falling apart, since this went into editing. We start with Jocelyn Kaiser, with shifts at major science agencies, then head into radiation regulations and nuclear weapons testing with Warren Cornwall and Rich Stone. We'll finish up with hiring restrictions for foreign workers at NIST with reporter Bob Service. First, here's Jocelyn.
There's a couple things that are happening with science in the U.S. that I wanted to kind of catch up on. One is a new contender for the head of the National Science Foundation, NSF. What's going on there, Jocelyn?
Yeah, so this was some surprising news last week. The person's named Jim O'Neill, and he was a kind of high-level official at the Department of Health and Human Services. He was acting director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and a little over a week ago, he was removed from those positions. And then last week, the news came out that he is being nominated, or will be nominated, to be director of the National Science Foundation.
And he's not a scientist.
Yeah, he's a humanities person, has also worked in tech investment. He's worked for Peter Thiel, who is a billionaire tech guy.
And he has some influence with the administration right now as we're seeing these nominations come through related to him. The other shakeup I wanted to touch on was O'Neill left CDC. So who's going to be in charge of the Centers for Disease Control now?
That was a big surprise last week, is that the current director of the National Institutes of Health, Jay Bhattacharya, is now going to be running the CDC as well as an acting director. And this has sparked a lot of concern for a couple of reasons. One of them is that both jobs are really big jobs, running NIH and CDC. And there's concern that, and both agencies have gone through all kinds of turmoil in the past year. Leaders are gone, huge staff cuts. And so there's a lot of concern that it's just too big a job for one person to handle. On top of that, the CDC is in Atlanta and NIH is outside DC in Bethesda, Maryland. And then there's also concern about exactly what Bhattacharya might do as head of the CDC. He was a fierce critic of the CDC during the pandemic. This is kind of how he made his name, critical of things like lockdowns and masking mandates. And so now he's going to be put in charge of that agency, and exactly what he may do has people worried. He also lacks the experience in public health that you need to run the CDC. If there was some sort of public health emergency, whether he could handle that, big question.
Absolutely. And now I know O'Neill, to take the helm of NSF, would have to be confirmed by the Senate. Is that also the case for Bhattacharya leading CDC? Would he also need to go through confirmation hearings?
What the administration has said is that he is going to temporarily be the head of CDC, which means that they are saying that they're going to nominate a permanent director who would need Senate confirmation. But how soon that may happen, I mean, he could be heading CDC for a while. There's some sort of technical glitch legal thing where if they don't nominate a director by March 25th, he could no longer be acting director. But from what we've checked on, he could continue leading the CDC in a kind of acting position, even if that's not the title he holds.
Touching back on NIH, where Jay Bhattacharya is in charge officially, one of the stories you reported out at the end here of February was on the changes in the way they're distributing funding to labs. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen, these changes that have happened under his tenure?
Yeah, the story you're talking about is about how the funding rates for investigators dropped sharply last fiscal year, which ended in the end of September 2025. So because even though NIH had the same budget last year and spent its budget, it didn't have a budget cut. But because of a mandate from the White House, the agency has been funding more grants as what's called multi-year funding, which means they hand out the funds for a multi-year grant in one lump sum. So what that means is if you fund more multi-year grants, you have less money for grants overall. So this has drawn a lot of concern because already people have looked at the grant numbers funded last year, like the new grants, and it dropped. You can see it in NIH's data, but until now, we haven't really known what that meant for an investigator applying for NIH funding. And this new data shows that the success rate for investigators dropped, as you would expect it would, pretty sharply last year. And the biggest concern is about what are called early stage investigators, young investigators who are kind of like the seed corn for the future. Their rate dropped from 26% to 19%. That's a pretty big drop. It means that almost 300 fewer young investigators were funded. And so that's got people very concerned. But the other kind of wrinkle to this is that until now, Dr. Bhattacharya, the head of NIH, has kind of seemed to blow off the concerns about multi-year funding. But for the first time in a blog post where NIH posted this data, they said this drop is probably due in part to this multi-year funding policy. So even people were kind of alarmed by the data, but at the same time, they said at least the agency is acknowledging this problem.
There's been a lot of back and forth. It seemed like at the beginning of the administration, there was this kind of, we're cutting funding. We don't care what Congress is doing. And there was a lot of pushback on that, lawsuits, people lost grants, got them back. But this is kind of another maneuver to change the way people are getting money out of NIH. Does that mean that it's going to continue this way, or do you think that more pushback's coming?
There was an effort by some members of Congress to stop NIH from essentially make them stop what they're doing with increasing the amount of money going to multi-year funding. But in the end, the language that got through in a funding bill really just holds them to what they did last year. So they are going to be able to keep doing this, funding a certain portion of grants with multi-year funding in this fiscal year, which means there's going to be probably another drop in how many people are funded.
All right, Jocelyn, thanks again.
You're welcome, Sarah.
That was Jocelyn Kaiser, the editor for our policy news section, Science Insider. Next, we're going to hear from our senior international correspondent, Rich Stone, about an allegation from the U.S. that China, quite a few years ago, tested a small nuclear weapon and what that means for the tenuous agreements in place on nuclear weapons testing. Here's Rich. Hi, Rich. Welcome back.
Hi, Sarah.
There's this kind of accusation, I guess, that China tested small nuclear weapons in 2020, but it's not clear.
There's a lot of mystery and confusion surrounding it. So there was this earthquake, or actually two closely spaced earthquakes in June of 2020 in the vicinity of the Chinese nuclear test site. Now, these could have been natural earthquakes, or they could have been a large chemical explosion, say in a mine, or they could have been a nuclear test. The U.S. alleged in the past couple of weeks that it was, in fact, a nuclear test, and the Chinese had sought to conceal it by decoupling, which means they did the test either inside a hollowed-out chamber where the material wasn't directly connected to the ground, so the seismic waves were dampened, or inside a containment vessel. That's the essence of the U.S. charge.
And the politics of this is if people are testing nuclear weapons, there's some international arrangements in place that are saying you're not supposed to do this, but if you do, maybe we will do this too.
There is a comprehensive test ban treaty that the U.S. and China and scores of other countries have signed, but the U.S. and China have not ratified it. Russia rescinded its ratification a couple of years ago. So all the major powers have said publicly that they're adhering to the test ban treaty, even though it hasn't come into force yet. There's plenty of reason that China in particular would want to test. It had conducted a few dozen nuclear tests before it signed the test ban treaty in 1996. The U.S. had conducted more than 1,000. Russia conducted several hundred. So the Chinese just didn't accrue the kind of information about nuclear weapons and stability and so forth.
What are they testing when they test a nuclear weapon? What are kind of the questions that are out there that they need answers to? Is this just we engineered something, but we don't actually know if it'll work?
They may know it will work, but they want to know more about exactly what kind of yield they're going to get out of it. That's for like a new weapon design. And the US is designing a new weapon as well for submarine launch that in an ideal world for the nuclear weapons designers, they would love to test it. But there's a broader question about the stability of plutonium, nuclear materials, the plutonium pits inside the weapons, and just their long-term stability. So the US and Russia and China do a lot of modeling that does not involve blowing up plutonium. This modeling is intended to demonstrate the safety and security of the weapon stockpiles in each country. Testing could give them more confidence if they wanted to do that.
So going back to the accusation of testing, is that something that the U.S. has special insight into? Like, how do we know, besides the fact that there might have been a small earthquake, that someone has tested a nuclear weapon?
Well, that's what is all very curious about this. So this happened 5.5 years ago. There was no allegation from the U.S. at the time. It just emerged recently in a public forum on disarmament. What would be the evidence of a test beyond the earthquake? So if it were an explosion, it was too small to confirm a nuclear explosion using the CTBT seismic arrays. The CTBT is a seismic station in Kazakhstan that picked up these waves, but it can't determine that this was a nuclear explosion. So the US may have other evidence. They may have, for example, intelligence overhearing conversations between Chinese nuclear scientists. They may have a satellite image of a containment vessel. And there are just inferences as well. So China's certainly modernizing, upgrading its Lop Nur nuclear test site. They've dug vertical shafts that could be used for tests, etc. So there's circumstantial evidence, but the US has not released any definitive evidence of a test.
This is kind of setting the stage for potential testing in multiple countries if this accusation is taken as reality or if this does prove out through other means.
Well, President Trump a few months ago vowed to resume nuclear testing on an equal basis. And State Department officials and the Disarmament Division have clarified that that is essentially referring to activities by China and Russia. The U.S. has also alleged that Russia in the past has violated the CTBT. So it's setting the stage for a return to testing if the U.S. decides to pursue that. If the U.S. does start testing again, China will gladly start testing again in response to the U.S., and Russia's not going to be left on the sidelines.
All right, Rich, thanks so much for letting us know. Keep us up to date on this.
Rich Stone is our senior international correspondent. Up next, we're going to hear from contributing correspondent Warren Cornwall on a somewhat related topic: potential changes to radiation exposure standards in the United States.
Basically, this came out of an executive order in spring 2025, and now we're starting to see how different agencies might consider changing their radiation standards. Why is this something that people want to do?
The reasoning that's offered by proponents of these changes is that it would help make it easier to build next generation nuclear power plants.
The levels now are pretty strict. There's language in place saying we need to kind of do the most to reduce exposure.
The standard that is used in the United States goes by the mellifluous acronym of ALARA. It stands for as low as reasonably achievable. Reasonably can mean a lot of different things. Reasonably can mean to take into account things like how costly is it? How much risk does it really pose? Things like that.
So that sounds flexible, actually.
Well, in theory, it does. It's just a question of how it's applied. And then there are some hard thresholds for exposure as well. Generally, there has been a push to get exposure levels pretty far below those thresholds.
We started with an executive order saying we need to change the way these restrictions work, but then you have to go down to the agencies that actually regulate radiation, and they have to interpret that and decide what they're doing, or that's what they're trying to do. So what are you seeing there at the different agencies?
Yeah, so this executive order was primarily aimed at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the NRC, which licenses commercial nuclear reactors. They are at the center of this issue. But the first agency to really move on this was the Department of Energy, which manages a lot of federal nuclear laboratories where there's a lot of work with radioactive materials. And then they also manage a lot of polluted sites left over from the nuclear bomb industry. They deal with radiation a lot. And in January, a memo emerged that was signed by Secretary Wright, who basically said that the agency should drop the use of this ALARA approach.
What about the nuclear regulatory aspect, the people that are in charge of overseeing nuclear power plants or the building of new plants?
Just to be clear, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission doesn't just establish standards for people in nuclear power plants. I mean, a lot of radiation exposure happens at like medical facilities or in research facilities. And so it's possible that although the executive order talks about nuclear power, the implications could stretch well beyond that. Yeah, so NRC is engaged in a rulemaking process that was triggered by this executive order. They're right now scheduled to come out with a proposed rule in April. Nobody that I talked to knew what that was going to say. So it remains to be seen whether they follow through on the executive order, which made it pretty clear that, according to President Trump, they should be doing away with ALARA.
And you talked to people who didn't think this was a good idea. Can you expand a little bit on their comments?
This goes back to some basic science. ALARA is not a scientific principle, right? It's a regulatory principle, but it's premised on this idea of there's no threshold below which radiation is safe. You can go all the way down to like an incredibly small level of radioactive exposure. According to this theory, it would still increase your risk of cancer. And so this principle of what's called linear no threshold, or LNT, then sort of leads you naturally to saying, well, we should get the exposure as low as we can, all other things considered. So reasonably achievable. LNT is fairly widely accepted, both by US sort of scientific panels that advise on these issues and on international ones, but it's not universally accepted. The science that sort of underpins it originally came from survivors of the nuclear bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but those were sort of acute exposure, sudden bursts of radiation. Epidemiological research has been emerging in the last decade or two that has been tracking hundreds of thousands of people who get more chronic low-dose exposures. So people working in the nuclear power industry, for example. You know, when I talked to one of the lead scientists in that field, they said the work they're seeing also supports this linear no threshold, that there's sort of no safe threshold. They're getting down to identifying an increase in cancer risk among people who receive a lifetime exposure equivalent to 500 chest x-rays, which is a lot of chest x-rays. I mean, we're not running around getting that. And in their studies, the average exposure was 180 chest x-rays.
The idea here is that you're looking at across hundreds of thousands of people. They're getting like low consistent dosages over years, and you do see an increase in cancer. And you can kind of calculate and say, there's no safe threshold. We're going to get more cancers across people. It's not one individual person. It's a statistical thing.
I mean, the counter argument is you have a lot of uncertainty when you get down to those really low levels. And so it's really not clear. And at some point, you wind up getting a little bit sort of ridiculous in terms of the level of protections that you need to pursue. And there are even some people who argue that there's research suggesting that very low dose exposures to radiation might actually be better for your health. There's this hormesis theory that it sort of induces cellular repair reactions that can actually make you healthier. That's not the most widely accepted theory, but it's out there.
But the main reasoning behind loosening the standards is that it's not easily achievable by new companies wanting to bring nuclear power plants online.
I don't know if it's easily achievable or not, but it's one of the main arguments for doing away with it, is that it will relieve sort of red tape for groups that are trying to move quickly to stand up sort of next generation nuclear reactors. I wasn't able to really talk to people inside the industry to get firsthand stories because they didn't return my calls.
All right, I think that's it for me. Did we miss anything?
There's one sort of weird side note, which is, and several people told me that one of the main drivers for this is these group of sort of startup companies that are really trying to press fast to build new nuclear power plants. Typically, these kind of things go through licensing from NRC, but the Department of Energy has invited 10 companies to basically build their experimental reactors under the DOE umbrella without NRC licensing.
So that's why that DOE is going first with their changing the radiation restrictions.
That's what some people suggested to me. They think that one of the major things driving this is that DOE is trying to sort of open the door for these nuclear startup companies.
All right, Warren, thanks for talking.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah.
That was contributing correspondent Warren Cornwall talking about potential changes to radiation standards. Finally, up next, we have a story on changing foreign worker restrictions at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, with reporter Bob Service.
NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are the federal government's resource for making scientific standards that are used in 1,000 different commercial enterprises. So it gets far beyond the length of the meter or the weight of a kilogram or something like that. They have to make standards for biotechnology, nanomedicine, for all kinds of things that are really critical to industry.
And there's a lot of research going on there. Over the years, we've published stuff with NIST labs. And the rule change here has to do with the access of international scholars, researchers from other countries to NIST labs, be it graduate students or full-fledged researchers. So what's changing?
We're not exactly sure. These are proposed rule changes that are being discussed. It sounds like some of the NIST top brass are proposing or talking to various managers who are passing it along to NIST scientists that it's very likely that rule changes about access to labs for foreign researchers are coming very soon, and in some cases have already arrived. So according to a bunch of my sources, foreign national NIST researchers have already been told that they no longer have access to NIST labs on evenings and weekends unless they are escorted by a NIST employee or a federal employee.
If you're a graduate student,
Yep.
That's killer.
Exactly.
That's killer.
On top of that, they've been told that beginning in March 31st, it's different for people for different countries, apparently. Again, this is all very fuzzy because nothing seems to be written down that's been publicly available. But if you are from certain countries, your access will be reviewed by the end of March, and you could lose access altogether. So right now, from what we're hearing, is that the access will be limited based on length of duration of time that you've been there retroactively. So if you've already been there 2 years, you could be told that you will no longer have access. You might be eligible for a waiver for a third year, but then beyond that, we're hearing that nobody will be allowed access, no foreign researchers.
After that 3-year period, yeah.
Yeah, after that 3-year period. And you mentioned graduate students. Imagine if you're doing a PhD. Most PhD research projects, I actually just looked this up, most PhD students take 6 years to complete their research and defend their theses.
How many people are likely to be affected by this if this rule does take effect?
Fuzzy, but hundreds. So I've been told by multiple people that could be as many as 500. But these are highly trained, highly skilled researchers. In many cases, it takes years to get up to the level of training necessary that they're pushing the frontier on some of these issues.
I just want to mention there are 2 NIST facilities. The one I know about is in Maryland, but there's another one in Colorado that hosts students and researchers from local and international schools.
Yeah, correct.
Is this because of security concerns? Like, is there classified work being done?
Nothing's written down, so we don't exactly know. Last week, some members of Congress on the House Science Committee wrote a letter to the acting NIST director expressing a lot of the concerns that they're hearing and asking for more clarity on all of this. From their letter and from other sources, it does sound like the main issue this whole policy or proposed policy is trying to address is increasing security. NIST does not do classified research. So I talked to a former NIST director this week. He was mentioning because there's no classified research, it's hard to imagine how these changes will help in security. There are frontline technologies that are being explored heavily at NIST, such as quantum computing or AI, that many people worry someday could be used to undermine security. For example, if one were to make a highly effective quantum computer, you could imagine, or it's been discussed, that could be used to defeat encryption technology. But I talked to a lot of people, and they all said that that's just years away. There's so much work that has to be done even to get to that level. So by taking some of the best scientists and best trained scientists out of the mix of the U.S. research community, you will actually be reducing your level of competence in those areas and almost guaranteeing that your competitors will win the race to those technologies, in which case you would be undermining your own national security. It's tough to make a case that this is going to benefit national security, at least in many of people's eyes.
You did it up with a lot of good quotes from people affected, but also people who have kind of been involved at NIST.
One of the troubling parts of it is that because these folks are foreign nationals, they're on student visas or other kinds of visas, they're limited in what they can do to support themselves. They can't just go out and, let me take students, for example. Students aren't directly employed by NIST. There are research agreements with the universities they're at. NIST helps fund those programs, and then the universities pay the students. And so those students need those stipends in order to live and work. If they lose access to the labs and lose their research project, they've just lost their livelihood. So now they're in a position of not only losing their PhD research, but they could very well have to leave the country because they can't support themselves.
There's not going to be an open slot back at their home institution that they can just jump into and continue their work.
Universities are scrambling to try to get other research projects and other sources of support for these folks, but it's just chaos. I mean, there was no notice given, essentially. All these people were just being told, okay, in a couple of months, you could very well be out of a job and out of a way to pursue your career.
The reactions have been really strong from your story, I can tell. All right, Bob, thanks again. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
That was staff writer Robert Service. And that's it for our policy roundup for February. If you want to keep up with all the policy coverage in the moment, go to science.org/scienceinsider. Submissions for the Eppendorf and Science Prize for Neurobiology are now open. The prize for neurobiology recognizes outstanding young researchers, age 35 and under, for exceptional neurobiological research conducted in the past 3 years. The winner receives $25,000 and publication of their essay in science. Apply now at science.org/prizes before the June 15th, 2026 deadline. Apply today for a chance to win the Science and Sci-Life Lab Prize for Young Scientists. This annual prize recognizes outstanding doctoral research in life science, including cell and molecular biology, genomics, proteomics, systems biology, ecology and environment, and molecular medicine. Apply today at science.org/prizes for a chance at the $30,000 grand prize. Submissions close July 15th, 2026.
Also out this week in news, senior biomedicine reporter Jenny Smith's feature story lays out how a wealthy family fighting their own disease boosted research on a little-studied brain protein called progranulin, and she writes about how this work may lead to new dementia treatments. Research published in Science Immunology looks at immune recognition of food. We often think about how the immune system contributes to intolerance, but its involvement in food tolerance hasn't been well described. Seed storage proteins from corn, wheat, and soy might help us understand how regulatory T cells might help mediate oral tolerance. Stay tuned for a look at readings that can inspire and inform. It's a kids' books roundup with senior editor Valerie Thompson.
Now we have senior editor Valerie Thompson with a slate of kids' books. For me, these kids' book reviews comes a little bit late. My child just finished a month of a reading marathon where she just had to read hundreds and hundreds of minutes all month long. But I still did note down a few of these to check out soon. Valerie, where did the ideas for this kids' books roundup, where do these books come from?
So these are actually two lists that are prepared annually by the National Science Teaching Association and the Children's Book Council. So there's the best STEM books K through 12 and the outstanding science trade books for students K through 12.
Yeah, I love that. If you look at these reviews, all of the people who wrote them are science staff.
And their kids.
Yeah, it's just so cool. I love that this has been a long-standing tradition for the magazine. So A lot of these books are actually profiles of scientists or science advocates. Is that kind of a general theme in the kids' books, STEM books genre?
Yeah, I think it's kind of more graspable for young readers to have like a real person to focus on, a real person's story. It kind of gives them a framework to think about their own lives and their own interests and how those might translate into a career in the sciences.
Okay, let's talk about a few. We'll go youngest to oldest. I hope I have this in the right order. First, Spider Lady. This one was added. I had never heard of any of this. This was great.
I know, I had never heard of this one either. So this is The Spider Lady, Nan Songer and Her Arachnid World War II Army by Penny Parker Klosterman. This is about a woman who turned her hobby of studying spiders into this massive spider farming operation to aid the U.S. war efforts during World War II.
Wow. So spider farming, who knew that was a hobby? What do they use the silk for? What do the spiders make?
So the spiders weave this silk that's like predictably thin and strong, and they actually use it for manufacturing crosshairs for things like guns and bombs and periscopes. So you need something that's like 1/10,000th of an inch in diameter for crosshairs. And I guess that spider silk meets this criteria.
Yeah, and the review is really fun because Evgenia, she's the science editor, wrote it with her child, and they're talking about it didn't touch too much on the war, but it did talk about how to like handle spiders at this like production level, which I think would be really fascinating.
Right. It's so interesting to think about like spiders as like entities of production, like you said, like they're kind of like focused on like how can we keep them warm and fed and comfortable and producing silk that is the right diameter. That involved like using different types of spiders, different times of year, and kind of weaving the silk together when they needed larger diameter fibers. And it's kind of like a wild story.
Yeah, it sounds like a kid who likes insects or arachnids or material science would find this book interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Next, this one I actually would love to check out. This is about Rube Goldberg, which I feel like has kind of never gone away in terms of popularity, but people don't know a lot of the kind of the details of the history here.
This book has kind of like an unwieldy title, which I feel like is kind of appropriate for Rube Goldberg. So the title is Smash, Crash, Topple, Roll, The Inventive Rube Goldberg, A Life in Comics, Contraptions, and 6 Simple Machines.
Yeah, that is a mouthful.
So this book is by Catherine Thymish. It's illustrated by Shanda McCluskey, which is a pretty big task to take on for someone to replicate the Rube Goldberg experience. You know, it's part biography of Rube Goldberg, who was this cartoonist at the turn of the 20th century. And then it kind of breaks down typical Rube Goldberg machines. And then it also explains kind of the physics behind simple machines like levers and pulleys and wedges.
And so that's kind of for young primary school students?
Yeah, I think that's for ages 8 to 12. So kind of right there in the middle grades, especially as these types of machines have become more and more popular with social media and especially with YouTube. I think that there's like definitely an appeal there for that kind of like tweenish age kid who might be consuming videos about this and might be interested in making their own, which there's kind of instructions for how to make your own Rube Goldberg machine.
I love that Mark Levine, he's a science editor who does very intense material science, chemistry, engineering. Like, it's the reviewer here. I think that's appropriate.
Yes, he took it very seriously and he did a very good job.
Yeah. Okay, the last one, I think this is a question a lot of us, not just children, have. Who owns the moon? This is for slightly older children and, of course, written by Daniel Clary. The review is by Daniel Clary. He's on the podcast a lot. He's a senior news correspondent here.
Yeah, so Who Owns the Moon? The book is by Cynthia Levinson and Jennifer Swanson. This is for kids age 12 and up. It's a seemingly simple question, and it was kind of answered in 1967 when there was this outer space treaty that was formed that determined that the moon shall be for the province of all mankind. But there's kind of bigger questions in there. So where does the Earth end and space begin? In other words, where does the treaty take effect? And if there is an accident in space, who's liable? And if an astronaut is hurt or gets into trouble, who's responsible for going to get them? And so there's all these questions that are theoretical, philosophical, and then ultimately policy questions about how we should be thinking about this. So there's some frameworks that we can sort of apply, like we can think about it like Antarctica. Is this something that we hold in trust and reserve for science? Or we can think about it like the ocean, which no one really owns, but everyone is allowed to extract resources from.
Yeah, and this is definitely something that people are going to care more and more about in the next few decades as, I mean, not just all these little satellites, but, planned trips back to the moon to potentially set up bases or extract resources there.
Which is so interesting to think that the children that are reading this book are going to be of the generation that has to kind of make these decisions.
I think this would be interesting for kids. I mean, we got kind of wonky there, but they are at that age once they're 12 and over where they are given problems there's no real answer to, and they have to look at all the different values and decide what would be a policy that makes sense or what they think the right thing is to do.
I think kids love questions like this too, like where they're just like kind of abstract, and it's not a silly question, but it's like, it is kind of silly. Like, it's like funny to think about that there's no precedent for this, I feel like kids don't encounter that a lot in their daily lives.
Often these book sections, these roundups are illustrated to kind of incorporate all the different elements from the books. Did something like that happen this time?
Yeah, it's actually so funny. We spend a lot of time working on these illustrations and like, oh, this element will reference this book and this element will reference this book. And like, I don't really know how closely readers are experiencing it, but it's kind of fun for us to make sure each of those elements are accurate. So
yeah, you got to find the spider, you got to find the moon, you got to find the contraptions, and a lot of other things here in this illustration.
Right,
beautiful.
Exactly.
It's going to be beautiful. Hi, Valerie. Thanks so much for coming on.
Of course.
Valerie Thompson is a senior editor for Science. You can find a link to the book reviews that we talked about at science.org/podcast.
And that concludes this edition of the Science Podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions, write us at sciencepodcast@AAAS.org. To find us on podcast apps, search for Science Magazine or listen on our website, science.org/podcast. The show is edited by Sarah Crespi and Kevin McLean. We have production help from Podigy. Our music is by Jeffrey Cook and Win Koi Win. On behalf of Science and its publisher, AAAS, thanks for joining us.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.